Hello everybody. Today we will be talking about the Populist Movement, which was a major force in American politics between 1892 and 1900. Here are the key questions and the key terms for the video this week. Please make sure you study these so you can do well on your video quiz. Alright, so let's start with a quick overview of the Populist Movement. So as I already stated, it was a major political force between 1892 and 1900. After the year 1900, populism begins to decline, but some of its major ideas are adopted by other major parties. The main force of the Populist Movement came from poor farmers who were angry about the economic situation that they found themselves in, and they organized against the vested interests of the Northeast, especially big business and wealthy people. And one thing that's interesting about the Populist Movement is that it's one of the biggest third-party movements in U.S. history, and it goes on to sort of set the model for other third-party movements that we'll see rise up later in the 20th century. There you see a picture of sort of laying out some of the ideas of the populist movement. So you see a dude wearing a hat that says labor. That means he's just a working class person. And on his back you see a giant burden of debt. And so this is how poor working people saw themselves during this time period, as basically owing tons and tons of money to banks and not ever being able to pay it back. And they view populism as sort of a way out of this situation. Before we go on, we should stop and think for a minute about what a third party is. So America is usually called a two-party system, and throughout the history of the United States there have been two major parties. Now the parties themselves have changed over time. You might remember that the first two-party system was between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. But these two parties fell away and split up and whatnot, and by the 1860s, we were left with the Republicans and the Democrats, and they have been the major parties since that time. And there are a couple reasons that our electoral system favors a two-party system, and the main part is that it's basically all the votes for a particular state go to either one party or another for a particular election. And so what this favors is some kind of party that's designed to appeal to as many people as possible. So rather than a bunch of small parties kind of targeting narrow interests, we get two big parties that try and attract as many people as possible. What this means is that it's really hard for third parties to make a splash. But they do rise up from time to time, and they usually form when some kind of new pressing issue emerges that the larger parties aren't talking about. So we'll see this with the Populist Party. We'll see it again with the Prohibition Party, which argues for the outlawing of alcohol. And we see it today with the Green Party, which calls for environmental reforms, and the Libertarian Party, which calls for reduced government interference and the ending of the war on drugs. So you might be asking yourself why third parties matter if they almost never win. And the reason they matter is because sometimes third parties will get popular enough that the bigger parties will take notice and adopt certain ideas from third-party groups. And we'll see that this happens with the populists after the populists become a pretty powerful group. So to get back to the populist movement, I want to start by giving you guys a little bit of background to explain where the populist movement comes from. And the first major thing we need to think about is the fact that millions of U.S. farmers by the 1890s had found themselves trapped under a mountain of debt that they couldn't get out of. And there are a couple reasons that this happened. The first reason that the farmers found themselves in debt was the switch to industrialized farming. And that's where farmers start using new industrial technology to increase the amount of food that they grow. The most notable change is that farmers started using big tractors and harvesters. So in order to compete, farmers had to buy these big machines in order to produce more food. Also, in this industrialized system, farmers started to specialize in a few major cash crops, especially grain, that is like wheat and corn. And what this means is that farmers' income comes primarily from selling a single crop on a world market, which means that if the price drops, then the farmers are going to have a rough time making any money. So anyway, in order to switch to industrialized farming, that is to buy the big tractors and stuff, the farmers have to take out loans from banks. And so the idea is farmers will borrow money from banks and then they'll farm for a while, and with the money they make farming, pay the bank back, and then they'll end up with a big tractor and some land. However, this doesn't work out, and the reason is when farmers start using industrial farming techniques, using tractors and stuff, they start to produce more and more food, which sounds like a good thing, right? Because if you produce more, then you can sell more. But this actually is a bad thing, and the reason is that when all the farmers in America start producing more and more food, the price of food starts to go down. Because there's more of it going around, people can pay a smaller amount and still get the same amount of food. And so this is good for people because the price of food goes down, but it's really bad for farmers because this means that they're not making as much money. And so the farmers are stuck with the big loans they took out to get their farming equipment, but they're not making any money because the price of food has gone down. And so what you find is that you get into this cycle where the farmers try harder and harder and harder to produce more food to make money, but the more food that the farmers grow altogether just drives the price of food even further down. And so no matter what the farmers do, no matter how hard they work, they can't really break out of debt. So they're stuck, and they're at risk of losing everything, and their land, their tractor, everything. On top of this, the economic system during the Gilded Age, as we've already talked about, was pretty unfair and was largely rigged in favor of wealthy and the big businesses in the United States. So as we already mentioned, the Gilded Age, politics was largely dominated by big businessmen and lobbyists and trusts and stuff like that. So basically the businessmen and the banks had more say over what the government did than the small farmers did, even though there were millions of farmers and, only a couple thousand big companies and, millionaires and stuff like that. But so anyway, because the government tended to listen to big business, they set up policies that helped big businesses and banks and hurt the average working person. The first of these was the high tariff. So remember, a tariff is a tax on imports, and what this means is that the price of manufactured goods go up because you can't import cheap stuff from other countries. And so what this means is that farmers have to pay more for all the stuff they get, but big business is allowed to charge more and make more money. So a high tariff directly hurts farmers and helps big businesses. Second was something called the gold standard. And the gold standard is a system in which all the money in an economy is based on gold coins. And gold, as you guys know, is very rare. And what this means is that there's not very many official coins or official money going around in the economy. And what this does is it keeps the price of $1 very high. So you guys might know that back in 1900 you could buy a whole week's worth of groceries for $1. Stuff like that. So anyway, a high-powered dollar really helps people who loan money out. Because if you keep the price of the dollar high, then when you get paid back later, you're going to get more money. On the other hand, a high power dollar hurts people who owe money, because if a dollar stays really valuable and you have to pay back $1,000, that $1,000 is worth a lot of money. This is a little complicated, and we'll talk more about it in class. But the idea is that a powerful dollar helps banks and hurts people who are in debt. And last of all, another issue is monopolies. So as you know, there were monopolies during this time period, and they weren't really regulated. The monopolies were allowed to do whatever they wanted. And the biggest monopoly that hurt the average person were railroads. So because there were railroad monopolies, what this meant for farmers was that if you ever wanted to sell your food to a big city, you had to pay a railroad company to get it to the city. And because the railroad companies were very frequently monopolies, this meant that the railroad could charge you a ton of money, and it would make it even harder for you to make a profit if you were a farmer. So all of these were problems that, on top of debt, made farmers very angry, and they felt like the democratic system was no longer working for them. Because of this, you see in the early 1890s the rise of the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party. And what this party does is it tries to help out the farmer and to take back some power from big businesses and from rich people in the United States. And their goal is to win power in the American government by winning elections. And what they're hoping to do is that they hope that they can unite farmers with poor northern workers in order to win a general election. And they have a bunch of interesting policies that we should take some time to look at. The main ones are that they want inflation through the switching from the gold standard to the silver coinage. We'll talk more about that in a minute. They want an income tax. That would mean that the rich people, the more money you made every year, would also mean the more taxes that you paid every year. They wanted the government to control monopolies to make sure the monopolies played fair. They wanted to restrict immigration, so that way immigrants wouldn't compete with them for work. They also wanted direct election of state senators, and they wanted shorter work days. So all of these were designed to make life better and easier for workers, and would probably have hurt big business if they had gone into effect. So anyway, the Populist Party calls for all of this stuff and nominates a dude named James B. Weaver for president. Let's look a little bit more at some of the policies of the Populists. Their biggest idea, and the one that they repeat over and over again, is their call for inflation through free silver. So real quick, inflation, if you guys remember, is where money loses its value. So if there is inflation, that means that at the beginning of a year, a dollar will buy more than later on in the year. So there is some inflation going on right now. We have about 1% inflation in the United States. And what that means is that a dollar today will be worth only 99 cents a year from now. So because of inflation, money slowly loses its value over time. And the Populists really wanted this. And they thought that the best way to get inflation was to get free silver. And the free silver is the idea where more and more money would be created by allowing silver to be used as coins instead of only gold. So silver is more common than gold, so if we switch to silver, then money would be less valuable. That would be inflation. And the reason they thought this would be a good idea was that if you increase the money supply, that the value of the dollar would drop. And the reason they wanted the value of the dollar to drop was that they wanted it to be easier for people who owed money to pay back their debts. So basically, if the value of a dollar went down, somebody who owed $1,000 would actually find it much easier to pay $1,000 because dollars would be worth less. Anyway, that was one reason for this, but a lot of people said that this was a bad idea. They said that it would hurt banks because the money that the banks got back would be worth less than when they gave it out. And they said that if they made a weaker dollar, then it would be harder for the United States to buy stuff from other countries. So it would maybe help farmers, but it could hurt banks and international trade. The other big idea that the Populists had was that the government should take control of monopolies. Maybe not take over the monopolies entirely, but set rules to make sure that the monopolies were behaving fairly. And so the big idea here was that uncontrolled monopolies are very unfair some of the times. They charge high prices and provide bad services, and there's nothing anybody else can do. However, there are some instances when monopolies actually make sense. For example, think about power companies. Would it really make sense for a single city to have 2 power companies running 2 sets of power lines to every house? That wouldn't make any sense. So sometimes economies or monopolies make sense because of economies of scale. Therefore, what the populists said is that the government should set rules to make sure that monopolies that do exist would not be able to act unfairly. The government would set fair prices for the monopoly to make sure that customers got fair prices, but the monopoly still made some money. So anyway, the main reason that the populists wanted this is that they wanted railroad prices to go down so they could transport their food to market more easily. But on the other hand, people argued that the government didn't really have a right to take over or control private companies. And they argued that business should be run to make the most money possible, not to try and help out society. That goes against the core idea of capitalism, they would have argued. So anyway, running on those 2 big ideas and the other ideas I mentioned, the populists try to take over the government. But they really don't do very well. The populists only win a couple small western states. They win Kansas, Colorado, Nevada, Idaho, and parts of Oregon and North Dakota. They only win 22 electoral votes. That's opposed to the Republican candidate, who wins 145 votes, and Grover Cleveland, the Democratic candidate, who wins 277 votes and takes over as president. So the populists fail to win most of the farming states and go on to lose the election. But things turn around for the populists in 1893. So in 1893, there is an economic downturn called the Panic of 1893. And what happens is, for a number of reasons, the American economy crashes, kind of like in the Great Depression, but less dramatically. It's not as big of a deal. It's still pretty bad, though. So there are a lot of different causes to this economic collapse. One of the big ones is that wheat prices are dragging down Western economies. Farmers can't really sell their wheat for profit, so it makes it harder for them to buy the stuff they need. Also, when things start to go bad, people rush on the banks and start taking out all their money. And when everybody takes their money out of the banking system, what this means is that the whole economy shuts down because there's nobody to borrow money from. So that's a really big problem. And when the banking sector goes into crisis, the economy is hurt, and within a year, the unemployment rate goes up from 4% to 18% of the population. And because the economy gets bad, more people turn and start to support the populist cause. And all of this culminates with the rise of a very powerful speaker and politician named William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan, who you see there, was a young man when he rose to prominence. He was a Democratic congressman from the state of Nebraska, a big farming state. And even though he's a member of the Democratic Party, he adopts a number of populist policies. Most importantly, he adopts the idea of free silver. And really nobody knows who this guy is, but at the Democratic National Convention, he gives this crazy, jaw-dropping speech called the Cross of Gold, in which he wins over a large part of the Democratic Party and ends up getting nominated for president. So this dude who comes out of nowhere gives a powerful speech and ends up nominated for president. He's only like 36 years old, and he's the youngest person to ever be nominated for president. And the main point of the Cross of Gold speech is that the gold standard is hurting the normal people in America. And he famously asks if mankind is to be crucified upon a cross of gold. Instead, he says, rather than all of us being crucified on the gold standard, that we should start printing silver coins and thereby help the people who are suffering in debt. So Bryan wins the nomination and goes on in the election of 1896 to face the Republican nominee, William McKinley. So Bryan wins the support both of the Populist Party and the Democratic Party. So just as we talked about, the big idea of the Populists has now been adopted by the Democratic Party. So the Populist Party is a third party. It kind of did its job. Its idea that it was really into, free silver, has now been taken up by the Democrats. So anyway, Bryan keeps calling for free silver. That's his main thing. And he wins a lot of support both in the South and the West, which are the major farming communities. McKinley, on the other hand, is kind of an old-fashioned type dude, and he wants to stick with what he knows, or what has been going on so far. So he wants to keep banks and big business safe because he views those as sort of the heart of American strength. And to do this, he wants to keep the gold standard to prevent inflation, which could hurt the banks. And he also wants to keep in place high tariffs, which would help boost American manufacturing, even though it would make prices higher for normal people. And McKinley also goes on to portray Bryan as crazy and argues that they don't really understand how economics work, that their ideas sound nice, but really it would just wreck the economy and make things worse for everybody. And there's a picture there of McKinley standing on a gold coin, calling for prosperity at home and prestige abroad. And so anyway, when it comes time to vote in the election of 1896, you see that the country is largely split. So you get the agricultural West and South are strongly in favor of Bryan. And so all of the agricultural states end up going to Bryan. But McKinley is able to win the entire industrial North and the Midwest, plus California and Oregon. And so even though he wins fewer states, because the North has a larger population and therefore more electoral votes, McKinley wins the election. So he's able to win without really winning any of the mainly agricultural states. I guess except maybe for like Iowa, which is definitely a pretty big agricultural state. So anyway, McKinley is able to win, and the interests of big business and banking win out against populists. 4 years later, there's another election. Once again, it's McKinley versus Bryan, so it's a rematch. And McKinley does even better this time. He wins more states, and he also nominates for his vice president a dude named Teddy Roosevelt, who's going to be pretty important later. And the big takeaway here is that the populists, even though they're pretty much united in all of the farming countries or farming states, are not able to go against the big industrial powers of the North. So what this means is that the farmers, even though they've given it their best shot, are not really able to change the American system in the way that they want it to change. So big banks, big business, and big cities win out against the farmers. And so what is the significance of the populist movement if they end up losing and Bryan, their main candidate, never wins? Well, there's been some debate about this, and historians don't really agree. Some historians argue that populism was the wave of the future, and they say that the populists' ideas catch on in the 20th century and actually become a normal part of American life. For example, the populists call for the government control of monopolies, and that happens like less than 2 decades later, and it still happens today. So for example, Time Warner Cable, the cable company in our area, is kind of a local monopoly, but the government checks the monopoly to make sure that they provide a reasonably decent service to our area. Also, we do end up abandoning the gold standard later on and allow our currency to inflate slowly over time. And we allow for an income tax where people who make more money end up paying more taxes than people who make less money. Other historians have argued that populism was a backward-looking fantasy. Basically that these guys didn't really understand how the world worked, and really what they were just dreaming of a better world. They weren't actually making the world better. They argued that the economic ideas of the populists would have weakened America, it would have hurt American industry and therefore put us behind the other major powers. They also argue that the populists really just wanted to go back to the way things were. They wanted to go back to an old-fashioned style of farming life rather than push forward into an industrial future. And so they say that basically any party that just wants to go backwards doesn't really have a future. And so anyway, this is a controversial subject, and there's definitely good arguments to be made both ways. And I'm interested to hear what you guys think as we talk about it next week. Thank you for paying attention. I know some of these economic concepts can be a little slippery. Don't worry, we'll definitely talk about them more in class on Monday. Thanks for watching. Here are your goals again, just in case.